Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
Mystery River by Elwyn J. Owens. Pilot Wright Nelson was making his first long trip alone in his biplane. He had crossed the mountain range in western Washington and had left the snow-capped peaks far behind. The narrow neck of northern Idaho had been passed over with the same speed, and then he was over a fertile valley in Montana. How beautiful it did look to him. The vast fields of waving grain, from his height, appeared like a green sea with just enough breeze to fan the surface into gentle waves. He slowed his machine and lowered his elevation so that he could get a better view. The closer he came to Earth, the more absorbed his thoughts became in the beauty of the country. Snap, crack, something broke. Pilot Nelson lost his head, so to speak. The machine was out of his control and started its plunge downward. 500 feet to go. Can I make it safely? What will Mother say? These were the last sane thoughts that flashed through his mind. Everything turned black before his eyes. To him, it seemed that his body was shrinking. He was dropping down through space, a dead weight. The earth seemed to open up. His falling body took on momentum. Into the opened chasm he fell. Down between its ragged sides, he glided, even faster than the plane. Faster, faster, faster he went. Suddenly he hit bottom with a thud that almost flattened him. He realized himself alone in a strange world, surrounded by strange beings. More than that, he was in the middle of a milky river, and when he tried to right himself, he found that his body floated easily in an upright position, with his head above the surface. He surveyed the situation. At the source of the river, he observed huge propeller blades similar to the ones on his biplane, only 100 times larger. They were fixed to stationary supports, but were slowly rotating, forcing the liquid of the mysterious river from them. Turning his gaze in the opposite direction, he noted that beyond him lay monstrous mountains, such as he had never dreamed of seeing. More still became the mystery. The river was being forced to run uphill by the huge propellers. Upon the bank, some distance from him, were nude persons. They came nearer to him, such ponderous masses of human flesh he had never seen. Large rolls of fat encircled their bodies, making them appear like human forms built up of odd-sized automobile tires piled one upon the other. Their bodies were gigantic, but such small heads, no larger than his fist. The eyes no larger than those of small birds. A crowd of them gathered on the bank. They conversed with each other by means of radio headsets and used floating aerials. All seemed to be happy. All seemed to be looking in his direction. He tried to call to them. They paid no heed. But when he motioned he was hungry, they laughed heartily and plucked straws from the ground. Through these straws, they gorged themselves with the fluid of the river. Having drunk their fill, they again laughed heartily, wiped their lips, motioned him to drink the same, and moved inland. Pilot Nelson took a swallow from the river. It nauseated him for a few moments. Then he began to feel his flesh bulge out, and his strength began to return. He plunged over on his side and tried to swim to shore. The contents of the river became thicker and thicker as he progressed. Soon he found it impossible to swim further. He tried to climb to the surface, but when upright he could only get his head above the milky matter that surrounded him. Soon he saw the inhabitants moving in large processions in the direction of the huge propellers at the source of the river. They threw large, tangled masses of wire above their heads. These, too, floated in midair, and he discovered that they were aerials, very much similar to the ones used in conversation, only many times larger. They snatched electrical current from the atmosphere. The propellers began to turn more rapidly. They began to spin. The contents of the river began to move more rapidly up the inclined bed, and he was carried with it. Besides being forced to flow uphill at a rapid rate, the river contained several whirlpools. Pilot Nelson floated into one of these. It spun him around like a top. He soon became dizzy. His vision was hazy. On and on the river carried him. The atmosphere became warmer and warmer the further up the hillside he floated. At last, the heat was torrid. Again, his body began to shrink. Smaller and smaller he became until, at length, he seemed no more than 3 feet high. The river was changing color. He was out of the whirlpool. The current had slackened to a slowly moving mass. The color changed from white to cream, then to chocolate, finally becoming dark brown. And as it changed color, it grew warmer and warmer until it was hot. His body was becoming seared. His clothing dropped off. His flesh was fast being dried out. Lighter and lighter he grew, and as he grew lighter, his body floated more and more above the surface. At last, he was fully emerged, nothing but a miniature of his former self. A still stranger land confronted him. Great rocks stood out, the only landmarks in the vast expanse of seemingly barren waste. Far back he saw the pygmies of dark complexion floating about, their feet just skimming the surface. Close to them, from out of the fissures in the rocky bed, floated up gases of many colored hues. He inhaled deeply, and to his surprise, he too floated across the surface. He was being carried by a gentle breeze in the direction of the pygmies. A great light of purple-white, so bright that it nearly blinded him at first, served as their sun. The pygmies seemed very busy. They did not notice him. He observed them carefully. No hair, no ears, no nose, no mouth. Simply a dark ball for a head and a face form that resembled a small, old copper funnel. Through this funnel they drank freely of the boiling hot liquid. Their eyes were large and green. Their arms were nothing but bare bones, and, at the end, were cupped hands with the fingers webbed together. They were boiling metals and precious stones in the fissures of the rocks. Silently he watched them. One would dip up diamonds in his cupped hands and sail away. Another would dip platinum and float off in another direction. He followed their course in the light of the great purple-white lamp, and noted that they deposited their wares here and there in small quantities, in what seemed the undersurface of the earth's crust. Suddenly, he heard what he thought was the chirping of a bird. The chirp became more shrill. He looked about himself and saw millions of these pygmies floating in from all directions. They surrounded him. A leader floated to the center of the assembly and began to scratch characters in the stone with his chisel-like foot. Soon, all was commotion. A stiff breeze came from the fissure in the rocks and blew toward the river. Pilot Nelson was carried in its course. When he reached the river, his body took on weight, and again he dropped helpless into the dark brown liquid. Numerous air currents began to agitate the stream. It began to flow again, and it flowed uphill. The huge purple-white lamp became brighter than ever. It blinded him. He could feel himself being carried rapidly through space by the current. The air was becoming cooler. He was somewhat refreshed, and his body enlarged to its natural size. Slowly, the dazzling light became fainter. He could see. Giant vegetation was on all sides. No leaves or branches, just huge, rough, gnarled roots. Again, the current of the river stopped. He was in blood-red waters, just a little more thin than the liquid had previously been. Still, he floated with just his head emerged. Mammoth animals were feeding upon the roots. Animals with skin like elephants, and legs no more than a foot long, 20 of them on a side. Their jaws resembled massive stone crushers. As they chewed into the vegetation, with sickening sound, a red fluid came freely from the roots. This the animals gulped up greedily, allowing only a small quantity to stream from the corners of their mouths. They drank their fill and soon became as large as the gas bags of dirigibles. They fell asleep where they fed. Thunderous shrieks rent the air, and Pilot Nelson heard the flapping of monstrous wings. Vultures, with wings 60 feet long, came to the spot. As they came closer, he observed that they had sword-like bills from 6 to 8 feet long. To him, they paid no heed, but attacked the sleeping animals, plunging their bills into their prey. Blood ran in rivulets from the struggling beasts. The sight became too much for Pilot Nelson. He tried to move, but found that he was paralyzed with horror. He sighed. To his surprise, his sigh was as loud as the sound of a locomotive whistle. The vultures were attracted by his involuntary expression. Overhead and about him, they circled in numbers, flapping their long, ponderous wings violently. Waves began to form on the surface of the river. Soon it began to move slowly. Again it carried him up the hill. Feathers of immense size dropped on all sides of him. A down from them seemed to fill the air, which his sight could not penetrate. Slowly the river flowed on. He was his normal size, but he had grown weak. In time, the air cleared of the feathers, and he could see. The light was like a summer day when the sun was out of sight. He was slowly floating into a great lake set amongst numerous mountains. Its contents was murky green. When he floated upright, his feet occasionally touched something. Soon he could stand on its bed. The current ceased, and he found himself in dead water. Such a dreadful odor. It was terrible, as of dead things. On the far shore he could see green vegetation, the same shade as the water. Slowly he made his way in that direction. The banks were covered with moss of pale green color. Such long, hairy moss. All a tangled mass. Through this he dragged on, almost fatigued. Little bushes covered the soil in front of him. He paused to examine them. Small, square leaves completely covered with worm nests, warts, and other growths. The branches seemed to be covered with silken ash, which fell at his touch. In his wanderings he came upon a spring of water, the first natural thing he had seen. But it had a peculiar taste. He investigated its source. Instead of flowing continually, It spurted in jets. He observed more carefully. A huge, muscular body, the color of an oyster, lay almost buried in the sand. It expanded and then contracted. When it contracted, it forced the water from an opening in its side. The sight of this caused Pilot Nelson to grow weak, so weak that he could not stand. He dropped down to rest. Almost immediately, a large, grass-green spider spun a thread across his chest and attached the end to the vegetation on the other side. Back across his legs, the spider spun another thread. He tried to rise, but found that he was tightly bound. Soon, numerous threads completely bound his struggling form. Strange noises came from all sides. He tried to turn his head so that he could see the objects, but found that the spider's web had bound his head. A slimy, crawling thing passed over his body. It began to chew at his toes. Such pain! He tried to call out, but could make no sound. Then a strange small bird with 4 wings flew over his face and began to peck at his fingers. Others came, and he was being besieged on all sides. One became more greedy than the rest, and in the struggle broke the thread that bound his head. He could now turn his eyes in the direction of his attackers. Suddenly, a film seemed to envelop his body, and he was immune from pain. But slowly and surely, the birds were picking away at his body, piece by piece. Out of the slimy recesses of the grass-green lake came a crawling, wriggling thing. It was half snake and half fish. As he lay with his face toward the lake, he watched it approach him, coming as if by instinct. It carried its head erect by means of small wings attached just below the back of its eyes. Its mouth was small, with short jaws, which it kept opening and shutting as it wriggled its way toward him. Closer and closer it came. He could now see plainly that its back was covered with mossy vegetation. Its belly was covered with scales. Its teeth, or fangs, consisted of 2 sharp protruding teeth on the lower jaw and a sort of broad, flat tooth on the upper jaw. The lower jaw it kept on moving up and down, as if in anticipating the feast of human flesh. He tried to turn his eyes from the object, but learned that the film that had deadened the pain had finally paralyzed his muscles. He could not move his eyes. They remained set on the object. When close to him, froth came from the corners of its mouth. It plunged its head against his side, sinking the teeth of its lower jaw deep into his flesh. Up came its head, and it had gouged out a piece of flesh. With one gulp, the snake thing swallowed a mouthful. It drove its fangs for another piece. Again and again it kept gulping down his flesh. The effect of the film was now dying out. He could feel the painful stabs of the fangs in his side, and for the first time realized that the birds had left him. He was alone with this carnivorous thing. The pain was growing more intense. In his agony, he tried to move. He could turn his head, but nothing more. The fangs again pierced his side, and he could feel them tearing away his bowels. He groaned, and then lay quiet. The groan seemed to relieve his agony. A human voice came quietly from a distance. "How is right this morning, Doctor?" It was his mother's voice. "I have just dressed the wound in his side. It is healing nicely. The crisis is past. He seems to show some signs of consciousness. and I think that he will be able to go home in the course of a month." Pilot Wright Nelson opened his eyes and found himself in a hospital, his mother at his bedside. A smile showed in the corners of his mouth. "Did the plane land all right, Mother?" he asked in a whisper. "Yes, it is all right, but do you know that you have lain here for 5 days without showing any signs of life while I worried about you?" She leaned over and kissed his cheek. "Are you going to fly again?" she appealed. "Never. I saw too much," was the quick response.
The Haysborough Pump Hill Ghost by Ernest Richard Suffling. At the present time on Pump Hill stands the instrument which has given it its name. Not many years since, a well occupied the same spot, but it has been covered in, and then it was called Well Corner. When the following incidents occurred, I cannot exactly say, but from all accounts, it must have been at the beginning of the present century, when a good business was done in this village in the landing of silk, lace, tobacco, spirits, etc., under cover of night, and a sovereign to cover each eye of the authorities. It appears that farmers coming home late at night were sometimes terribly frightened at a figure they saw coming up the main street of the village from the direction of the cart gap. It was an unusual figure, even for a ghost, for although it made good progress, it was legless, and, I might add, headless, for its head hung down its back between the shoulders. In its arms it carried a long bundle, but what the package contained none knew, not even those who had seen it. It was evidently a sailor, for it was dressed in the petticoat-looking garment in vogue among seafaring men in those days. Moreover, it wore a broad leathern belt with a huge brass buckle, in which was thrust a pistol, and a long pigtail graced its head, so long that from the position of its head it nearly trailed the ground. After several farmers had been frightened nearly out of their lives by this legless mariner, 2 of them, more hardy than the rest, resolved to watch his ghost ship, for ghost it must be. For how could a legless man possibly walk or progress as this one did? Several nights they watched vainly, but at last one night came the bold smuggler sure enough, and the farmers quakingly followed it. Although its head was reversed and turned away from the direction in which it was going, it still kept a straight course along the middle of the road, until it came to the well. Here it paused, and balancing its burden in its arms, dropped it endways down the mouth, and after gliding aimlessly around for a minute or so, quietly disappeared down the well also. The farmer's story was next day told at a village council, and by many heartily laughed at. But despite the incredulence of their friends, they stoutly maintained the truth of their tale. At length it was agreed to search the well, so ropes and ladders, etc., being procured, a volunteer was quickly found to make the descent. A lighted candle was first lowered in a ball of clay to test the atmosphere, which being found pure, a looped rope, in which a young man was seated, was carefully lowered. 40 feet he went down with a lantern, but could see nothing, and was being hauled up again when he caught sight of a piece of dark blue cloth hanging on a projecting brick. This was exhibited, and again young Harmer descended, this time armed with a long clothes prop. Anxious moments followed, and then came his voice up the well shaft, in strange, sepulchral tones. "I can feel something soft at the bottom." Accordingly, an iron hake, or pothook, tied to a clothesline was lowered to him, and after a while he succeeded in entangling it in something. He was hauled up, and then the clothesline too, and at the end of it came up a sodden sack tied at the mouth. It was eagerly opened, and a pair of boots protruded, which upon being withdrawn from the sack were found to contain the legs of their owner, hacked off at the thighs. Harmer was asked to try his luck down the well once more, but he declined to venture, his find having shaken his nerves very considerably. With the help of a little Dutch courage, a fisherman was at length prevailed upon to go down and see what he could grapple. Down he went, and those who could crowd near enough to the well side to peer down saw him at work angling with his line and hake, but a long time went by without any result. Something soft he could feel with the clothes prop, but he could not hook it. He wanted more refreshment, so a bottle of rum and water attached to a string was lowered to him. After a refresher, he again went to work, and presently hooked a weighty object, and gave the signal to haul him up. Just as they were doing this, the object was hauled from the water by those in charge of the clothesline, putting his light out. However, the villagers hauled at both ropes, and the fisherman quickly appeared, bearing in his arms, or rather half supporting, a large mass of what looked like wet clothing. Quickly dropping it on the ground upon arriving on terra firma, he turned it over, and, to the horror of those present, revealed to view the decomposed body of a man, whose head was only attached to the body by a small flap at the back of the neck. There was the broad leathern belt with a pistol still hanging in it, and the peculiar petticoat of the period. In fact, everything just as the farmers had described as appertaining to the ghost. Search was made, and in a week or so evidence was brought to show that the black-bearded sailor had been murdered near the cart gap, as a large patch of blood and the corresponding pistol to that in his belt was found in a desolate bullock shed close by. 3 or 4 gold pieces were also found embedded into the earth, and fragments of 3 empty Schiedam bottles were strewn about. Nothing was ever discovered of the murderers, nor was it ever heard who the murdered man was. It was at the time supposed that there had been a row among some smugglers, and that in dividing their spoil, one of them had quarrelled with his comrades, who had killed him by nearly severing his head from his body, and that to make the corpse easier of carriage to the well, they had hacked off his legs and placed them in the sack in which they were found. The money trodden into the soil gives colour to the theory of the division of the spoil, and the 3 broken bottles shews there must have been several carousers. They were supposed to have been Dutchmen, but why they carried the remains of their comrade nearly a mile inland to the well, when they might have easily buried the body in the sands, remains, as does the whole affair, a mystery.
Strange indeed are the possibilities of the human mind. A weird example is found in The Death Cell by F.K. Moss. Man is, by nature, an experimenter, argued my friend Dr. Armand, a psychologist of some repute, and he is steadily delving into the unknown and bringing to light knowledge that is often appalling in its intricacy of concept. He gathers about him a few relatively simple pieces of apparatus and discovers the existence of particles infinitely smaller than the most minute object visible under the ultramicroscope. He measures its size, mass, electrical charge, and in truth finds out more about it than he knows of visible objects. All of this he learns about matter that he can never ever hope to see with his naked eye. The simple but marvelous instrument, the spectroscope, tells him of the composition of the stars. It told him that upon the sun there was an element unknown upon this earth. He called it helium, and later discovered and isolated the gas, after first finding it at a body millions of miles away. Beautiful indeed is modern science. Armand paused for a moment, as if to more fully comprehend the scope of the subject, and then continued. But the most refined and sensitive piece of apparatus, if I may call it that, and about which so little is understood, is the human brain. A vast amount of research has been done along the lines of psychology by many able men, and the data has been formulated into several well-established hypotheses, and yet, he stretched out his arms in a vague sort of gesture. How little we really know about the brain. We had met, as had been our custom, at Armand's apartment to enjoy an afternoon together and to discuss old times and friends. I must confess, with all due respect to the doctor, that the subject was often soon changed into a scientific lecture by him on his favorite theme, psychology. I really enjoyed these informal talks immensely, for there is no more entertaining speaker than the scholarly Armand. I nodded. Yes, I suppose so, but it seems a natural consequence, the brain. How can the brain be studied and mathematically analyzed like, well, mechanisms, for example? Perhaps that is not such an impossibility as it would seem, said Armand. In the past, the whole proposition has been studied, conceiving of the brain as a matter quite as abstract as the soul. The more recent school of investigation has attacked the problem, bearing in mind that, after all, the functioning of the brain might be governed by the same laws of physics that can be universally applied elsewhere. The application of the electron theory is not absurd in the least. However, all research must be based upon the axiom: if an occurrence can be made to take place under certain conditions, then the repetition of those conditions should invariably produce the same occurrence. As yet, this fact has not been established firmly in the case of the brain. I have, he continued, just finished obtaining the data on the most absorbing case I have ever had the opportunity to study. The data is available only in fragments obtained from various sources, and in many places I have been forced to bridge the gaps by drawing purely from my concept, or imagination, of what took place. I was deeply interested in Dr. Armand's work, particularly in a case which he has deemed so extraordinary, and I urged him to relate the thing in some detail. The first part of the amazing affair is of common knowledge and varies little from many other cases on record. However, the weirdest and most intensely absorbing episode began after the rest of the world conceded the whole unfortunate affair closed forever. Perhaps it would have been closed had the principal actor been slightly different in mentality, or even in a different mood at the critical hour. Potentially, there might be many possibilities of such an occurrence, but the probability of the combination of the required circumstances at the critical hour is infinitesimal. Even the exact repetition of the conditions might not necessarily produce the same results. Dr. Armand related the story as he conceived it, prefacing his remarks with the statement, "If the reactions of what we term the abnormal mind could only be chronicled, we would stand aghast at what would be written." Dr. Armand's strange narrative. The friendship of James Mackay and William Larson was a source of wonder and pleasure to their mutual friends and acquaintances. Such was the close companionship of the two men that they were often laughingly referred to as David and Jonathan. Each regarded the other with pride, respect, and understanding. Possibly, there could not have been found a more glorious example of love of one man for another than this one. Certainly, few, if any, would have been so mentally constituted as to produce reactions which would have led to such terrible results. Mackay had met Larson some 6 years previous, through his newspaper work, both being on the staff of the Denver newspaper. Strangely, in view of their latter friendship, neither was particularly attracted to the other until some time later. On this occasion, Mackay had been asked to sit in on a card game at Larson's apartment, which he willingly did, for games of chance were attractive to Mackay. The party lasted nearly the entire night, and upon breaking up, Larson offered to share his room with Mackay, as the latter lived at some distance. What drew the two men together is impossible to say, but their friendship must have ripened quickly, for the next evening found Mackay established permanently as a roommate of Larson. In appearance, if their expressions were analyzed, the two men were strikingly alike, enough so to be readily taken for brothers. Both were of a slender, athletic build, dark complexioned, and with sharp, clean-cut features. Sportsmen, in every sense of the word. In character, however, there was much difference. Mackay, the younger, was an impulsive, quick-acting, and confident sort of fellow, easily offended, but correspondingly quick to accept an apology. While clever in many respects, he was not given to concentrated and painstaking study. This trait was evident from his writing, original, snappy, entertaining, but often lacking in fine details of accuracy. Larson, on the other hand, was of a more conservative type, dour but more positive in his actions, and of a nature which inquired into things in a thorough and precise fashion. Such was the well-known friendship of the two that great was the surprise to all who knew Mackay when, his face black with anger, he entered the barroom of the Palace Hotel and demanded, "Where's that damn Larson?" Friends at once tried to ascertain the trouble and also to urge him to return to his home, as he had evidently been drinking heavily. But Mackay was in no mood to be pacified by his friends. "Don't interfere in my affairs," he snarled. Then he ordered a drink, swallowed it in a gulp, and then seated himself in a far corner of the room. McFadden, a close friend of both Larson and Mackay, went over to him and, linking his arm in Mackay's in a hearty and jovial manner, attempted to take him away. Mackay turned on him so savagely that he gave it up, resolving to find Larson and learn the reason for Mackay's anger. As McKay only sat and watched and waited, his eyes blazed with a deadly gleam. McKay had become, as Larson expressed it, hypnotized by and infatuated with a really beautiful but altogether shallow and irresponsible sort of woman. The affair had caused Larson a great deal of annoyance, as McKay would, at times, become extraordinarily cheerful, and then sink into spells of despondency, so sullen and irritable that even the quiet-natured Larson found it impossible to live with him. These moods, as Larson well knew, were occasioned by Miss Conway's treatment of Jim. Her influence over McKay seemed as unlimited as it was magical. Larson had tried to reason with Jim, and had decided to convince him that Miss Conway did not care seriously for him, or anyone else, except herself. But all his efforts produced no other effect than to kindle new passion in McKay. On the evening mentioned, McKay had asked permission to call at her house, but was refused. She pleaded a previous engagement. For some unknown reason, the guiding hand of fate for those who believe in fate, he walked out to her house, and as he drew near saw Larson, his old pal, Bill Larson, enter the house of Miss Conway. For a moment he stood as if stunned. Of all persons, Bill was the last he would have suspected. Then it all became plain to him. Bill had tried to alienate the girl's love. Slowly, listlessly, McKay turned and retraced his steps to his room. He sat there a long while in the dark and let his mind become polluted with the poison of an insane jealousy, while he saturated his system and dulled his conscience with whiskey. About 11 he rose, placed a gun in his pocket, and started for the hotel where he and Larson often met in the evening. As he walked, his mind became closed to reason, closed to his regard for his friend, closed to everything except that Larson had double-crossed him. As he sat and waited in the barroom, his brain focused itself on this one point, until it had taken possession of him. He had been there about half an hour when Larson appeared, laughing and chatting with some friends. Bill was in great spirits, for he had accomplished that night the thing he had long sought. Miss Conway had been very reasonable, and had promised that she would cause McKay no more anxiety. McFadden and a few others hastened at once toward him to tell him about McKay, but they were too late, for Larson, spying McKay, sang out, "Hello, Jim, old scout. Come over and heist one with us." McKay jumped up and strode over to the bar, his eyes glittering and his mouth twitching with hatred. "You damned—" and he leveled an accusing finger at Larson. "Jim," cried Larson, "what's wrong?" Larson was greatly shocked and distressed over the condition of his friend, and he overlooked, if he heard, the insult hurled at him. "So that's what you wanted," McKay snarled. "My God, Jim, what is it? You may have beaten me, but you will never, never get her." And a stream of fire leapt from McKay's gun, and Larson dropped to the floor, uttering but one word. "Jim!" The weapon dropped from McKay's limp hand, and his face was ashen as he gazed, speechless, at the bleeding and lifeless body of his best friend on earth. He slowly turned away, and later surrendered himself to the authorities. The tragic affair caused a great deal of comment. Some 3 weeks after the murder case was brought to trial and attracted widespread interest. A dingy West Side courtroom was crowded to capacity. Friends, acquaintances, businessmen, curiosity seekers fought for seats. Considerable difficulty was encountered in selecting a jury. The popularity of the murdered man, as well as the defendant, made it hard to find an unbiased yet capable juryman. After that, however, the trial was brief, the end coming with an almost startling suddenness. The state's case was plain and simple. The evidence was overwhelmingly against McKay, and the situation was not improved by his refusal to offer any defense. His attorney put up a plea of temporary insanity. His arguments held weight. The plea was elegant and logical, and probably would have been a deciding factor had not McKay himself, at the conclusion of the address, risen, and, to the dumbfounded court and attorney, refused to accept insanity as a defense. The jury was out 50 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty in the first degree and recommended the death penalty. All eyes turned toward McKay, who remained perfectly emotionless. The judge then pronounced the death sentence on James McKay. The friends of McKay were surprised at the severity of the penalty. Especially dejected over the outcome were McFadden, a brother newspaper man, Kirk, an oil operator, and Bernard, a young medico. For these three, with McKay and Larson, had formed what was termed the gang. Now one of the five was dead, and another was sentenced to be hung. They at once demanded a new trial, but it was refused. Scarcely could the men refrain from emotion when McKay asked them and his attorney to settle up his worldly affairs. As he was without a family, he willed all his property to his three friends, and even mentioned in some detail a few personal effects he wanted each to have. Of all present, McKay was the least affected by the scene. His voice and movements were those of an automaton rather than a human being. Indeed, he was practically such, and had been so since the death of Larson. After attending to the last detail of his worldly affairs, he rose and silently shook the hands of his friends. Accompanied by two plainclothesmen, handcuffed wrist to wrist, he left them and started on his trip to Canyon City. He had often visited that little Colorado city and had spent many a pleasant time there. He requested the officers to drive down 17th Street. At one end was the golden dome of the state capitol, brilliantly aglow with the crimson rays of the setting sun. And at the other was the station, dark against the purple snow-capped Rockies. As he neared the station, he looked longingly and sadly at the huge arch erected at the entrance. The word Mitzpath was emblazoned across the arch. The utmost consideration was shown McKay by the prison authorities, who were well acquainted with the young reporter. The warden met him at the office and personally took him to the death cell. The door clamped shut and the bolts shot in place with metallic harshness, and the law began to exact its penalties as it had done in the Dark Ages, caging him in with stone and steel. 5 days passed, long grinding days and longer nights, for sleep no longer supplied periods of relaxation. His friends were agreeably surprised when they visited him a few days later to find him in an apparently cheerful frame of mind. He talked of Larson in the freest sort of manner. He delighted in dwelling upon the characteristics of his late friend. More and more as the days passed by, did he like to discuss Larson. He would relate incident after incident in the life of the latter which, due to the closeness of their friendship, he knew quite as well as his own. As to his impending execution, he seemed surprisingly unconcerned. Calmly, and without bitterness, McKay waited for justice to take its course. Bernard and McFadden were silently playing pinochle, while Kirk stared moodily out the window at the cold and drizzling rain. The spirits of the men were at a low ebb, and they had met that Wednesday evening only through force of habit. Efforts to liven up the evening had been made, but with no enthusiasm, and it promised to be as dull as the weather outside. "Why not?" suddenly muttered Kirk, half to himself and half aloud. Bernard and McFadden turned around and eyed their companion curiously. Kirk went over to his desk and started searching for something. Reseating himself, he read and reread the newspaper clipping he had taken from the desk. The expression on his face was so strange that the pinochle game was abandoned, and his friends attempted to learn the cause of his unusual behavior. "What is the matter with you?" demanded McFadden, somewhat impatiently. "Read that!" and Kirk forced the clipping into McFadden's hand. The latter glanced at it briefly, then gave it his undivided attention, and then passed it over to Barnard, who was exceedingly impatient to read it, after noting its effect upon McFadden. Barnard's expression instantly changed from one of curiosity to one of great seriousness. Kirk looked at McFadden in an effort to appraise the effect of the article, and read an excitement equal to his own. Together they turned to Barnard, who read aloud. Chicago, March 8th. The startling disclosure was made today by Chicago detectives that associates of Red Murphy, gunman, who was hanged this morning, had all but succeeded in restoring Murphy to life. The request was made and granted for the body immediately after being taken from the scaffold. The body was placed in an ambulance and whirled away. Inside the ambulance, hot blankets, pulmotor, and restoratives were applied until Murphy began to breathe again. The desperate attempt was futile, however, as Murphy died a few minutes after being revived. For at least 15 minutes after Barnard finished, not a word was spoken. Finally, Kirk turned to Barnard. "You are a doctor. What about it?" Barnard deliberated. "Yes, it might be done if the neck was not broken by the drop. If such was the case, death would be produced by strangulation." Gone was the boredom of the evening, and in its place was created a plan that was to write additional chapters beyond the finis placed on the case of James Mackay by the state. Throughout the entire night, they discussed the plan, accepted and rejected it time and time again. There were many phases to be considered. The probability that Mackay would be hanged without having his neck broken finally became the crux of the argument. Kirk suggested a plan. McFadden, as a newspaper man, would have access to the death chamber. The rope could be shortened, and the knot fixed it to the scaffold could be arranged so that it would slip a bit, thereby easing the shock of the drop. McFadden immediately protested and refused to consider such a move. It would be torture for Mackay. Barnard said, "I could give Mackay a shot that would dull any pain produced. Jim would not stand for a hypo. He would not notice it in the excitement and confusion of being bound." Throughout the discussion of the proposed plan, the possibility of legal consequences for themselves was not considered. They were playing for the life of a friend, and the ethics of the methods were of secondary importance. By morning, they had formulated and agreed upon a definite plan of procedure, and before separating, they spent a few moments in anticipation of the joy of the reunion, if they were successful. Although Mackay had taken the life of an equally close friend, so well did they understand the conditions that they extended their sympathy rather than censure. Day by day, details of the plan were carried out. Each was assigned a definite part of the work to be done. McFadden spent all the time he dared spend at the penitentiary. He familiarized himself with the equipment of capital punishment. He studied the tying of knots. He experimented and found the best possible way to adjust the rope so that the shock of the drop would be taken up as smoothly as possible. Nor could a more zealous medical student be found than Barnard. He sought out every possible reference on the subject, prepared emergency equipment to the last detail. The day before the execution, McFadden and Barnard left for Canyon City. Kirk remained in Denver. That night, Kirk got out Mackay's suitcase and started packing it. Mackay was in the center of a solemn little group that, with precise movement, passed down the steel corridors. They entered the death chamber, and it was McKay who sought to cheer his friends. He stepped upon the trap, and the officials bound his wrists to his thighs with wide leather straps. He laughed and joked with his friends, who could not force a laugh from their dry-set lips. Then, while the hangman stood waiting with a black hood, the chaplain offered up a few words in prayer. McFadden stepped up and bade his friends farewell. Bernard then came up and in a strained manner clapped McKay on the shoulders and said, "So long, old scout," and then stepped down quickly, concealing a small hypodermic syringe in his pocket. Bernard and McFadden left the room and waited just outside, where they exchanged significant glances. Each knew the other had not failed in his task. A few seconds later, they heard the trap drop, and for 11 excruciating minutes, an eternity, they waited. The prison physician pronounced McKay dead, and they returned. The body was cut down quickly, then turned over to Bernard and placed in a waiting ambulance and whirled away. Once again, the experiment was being tried. The long chance won. After a desperate effort, Bernard's work was rewarded by a slight and uncertain breathing by McKay. McFadden noticed this and scarcely could refrain from shouting with joy. Bernard, however, quickly assured him that the result as yet were far from certain. The body reached the mortuary, and, by well-laid plans and judicious selection of undertakers, was placed on a bed rather than on the marble slab of the embalmer. Bernard watched his patient with close attention, while McFadden hastened to telegraph Kirk, who was waiting in Denver. The three friends were gathered about McKay when the latter regained consciousness after hours of quiet and restful sleep. McKay opened his eyes, shut them. Then, with eyes wide open, hand on his forehead, he gazed in a glassy manner about the room. His whole body quivered for a few seconds, then relaxed, and then he spoke in a hoarse and mechanical tone. "What?" His eyes wandered about, and his words became inarticulate. Finally, What has happened?" "Steady, old man," said Bernard. "Everything is okay. You came out fine." Again McKay stared. "Came out? Came out of what?" "Don't you realize?" Bernard interrupted Kirk, and with a look warned McFadden to remain quiet. "Never mind, old boy. Best up a bit, and then we'll explain." McKay was not satisfied. He asked, "Where is Jim? Jim McKay?" "What?" The three friends riveted their eyes on McKay, and slowly, first with Bernard, an expression of horror spread over their faces as they understood what had happened. The shock of being launched into eternity, only to be snatched back by his friends, had, as the law demanded, blotted out the life of McKay, and they brought back William Larson. Armand finished, and I turned over in my mind many questions that wanted answering. Is there any explanation of the transition of the personality, or soul, of McKay to that of Larson? "Yes," said Armand. "The brain is composed of two hemispheres, one of which receives impressions and is the seat of thinking. The other hemisphere remains thoughtless. Undoubtedly, after the normal section became somewhat paralyzed by the melancholia of those terrible nights alone in the death cell, the thoughtless section must have received impressions. You will remember that, following his melancholia, McKay desired above all else to talk of Larson. And in dwelling on this, the usually inactive hemisphere probably received its impressions. Do you believe that will be always Larson as Larson?" I asked. "It is my belief that he will. He says that he is Larson, and he acts the life of Larson, Impossible as it may sound, I believe that exactly 6 years from the day of his execution, McKay, as Larson, will die, a victim of autosuggestion and the vividness of his imagination.
The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was a sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me, he had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh so cautiously. Cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he has passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still, and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening, with its dreadful echo, the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears have been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now I say there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder, louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head, and the arms, and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber, and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. A tub had caught all, ha ha. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no! They heard, they suspected, they knew! They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark! Louder, louder, louder! Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here! It is the beating of his hideous heart.